Hello, friends. Welcome to the India International Center webinar on India's Neighborhood First Series. Some of you who've been attending earlier webinars would recall last year we did at least 4 of these on neighboring countries. And this year we are starting this India's Neighborhood First Series with Nepal. Now, as all of us or most of us would know, that Nepal is faced with a constitutional crisis, largely the making of the domestic leadership of the Nepal Communist Party. And it's very unfortunate that after a long time, Nepal, which got a communist government for the first time, not for the first time really, because in 1994 they had a communist government led by Manmohan Adhikari, a UML government, but this time they have a Nepal Communist Party government with a 2/3 majority. Not just that in the provincial councils, 6 out of 7 provincial councils are led by the Nepal Communist Party. And at the local level, at the municipal level and the local level, almost 80% of the seats were won by the Nepal Communist Party. So this was an unprecedented situation, a great opportunity for Nepal for political stability and economic revival. In fact, the slogan of the government at that time was, or I'm sure still is, political stability for economic development. And then this internal development takes place. Rivalry between two former prime ministers, Prachanda Pushpa Kamal Dahal and K.P. Oli. And the rivalry has landed Nepal into this current mess, what people are calling the constitutional crisis. So somewhere along the way, the leadership lost the plot. This personal rivalry, this ego, arrogance, ambition of the leaders put the country in a tailspin, especially when the COVID pandemic is on, the economy is not in any good shape. So all these factors combined together have landed Nepal in the current situation. The Prime Minister K.P. Oli has, on 20th of December, went to the Supreme Court. The case of the constitutional crisis will be decided by 2 bodies, the Supreme Court, whether the Supreme Court will restore the constitution or restore the house, dissolved house, or the elections will be held as ordered by Prime Minister on 30th April and 10th of May. And the Election Commission also will take cognizance of the fact that these leaders have the two factions of the party, the de facto now, the split that has taken place. So we have an excellent panel today to put all this into context of the COVID pandemic, the rivalry between India and China, where does the US fit into all this? So to give us a comprehensive picture of the current situation in Nepal, we have Dr. Nishchal Pandey. Dr. Pandey is the director of the South Asia Studies Center in Kathmandu. We also have Professor S.D.MUNI. Professor S.D.MUNI is virtually the last word on Nepal. He's written this book on India-Nepal relations. And the third speaker is myself. I have known Nepal for many years, since 1959. And I've also written a book called The Royal Nepal Army Meeting the Maoist Challenge. So we have practitioners and we have academics and professors. So this is a great combination of expertise, and you can look forward to suitable analysis of what's going on. So we'll start the discussion with Dr. Nishchal Pandey. He will be followed by Professor S.D.MUNI, and in the third speaker will be myself. So why don't you start, Dr. Pandey, 10 minutes, and if you will also cover the COVID situation in Nepal and your presentation, Dr. Pandey.
Thank you, India International Center. Thank you, Jawaharlal Mehta, for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the political crisis in Nepal. Jawaharlal Mehta, I remember with fondness the all-party conference that you had convened in 2004 at the IIC that brought together all factions and representatives of all major political actors in Nepal. It was a historic event. But today, Nepal stands at the crossroads again. It's a curse of destiny that no government has survived 5 years ever since Prime Minister Juddha Samser went into self-exile in India. No parliament has survived a full term. And it's always that the prime ministers have not been able to resolve the inner party differences, resulting in the dissolution of the House. And the elections thereafter have always resulted in a hung parliament. So a majority government does not survive due to inner party wrangling. A minority government does not survive because it can't prove a majority. So how many political experiments are we going to conduct in Nepal? So now, yet again, the constitution itself is in danger from the very people that drafted the constitution. If the Supreme Court validates the Prime Minister's decision to dissolve the House, obviously it cannot be held within 6 months, then who is going to rescue this constitution? If the House is reinstated, as you mentioned during the preliminary remarks, it is obvious that there will be enormous political upheaval before the dust settles down. I see 3 scenarios. Number one, legally the Nepal Communist Party is not formally split according to the Election Commission. Technically, there are still 2 chairmen of the ruling party, among which one is the Prime Minister, and he is also leader of the parliamentary party. The Chief Justice, during the course of the legal debate that is going on in the court, has asked this question to the prosecution. What if the Prime Minister dissolves the House again? And I think this is a very valid question by the Chief Justice, because if the party is not legally split, he is also the leader of the parliamentary party. And in a reinstated House, the Nepal Communist Party is going to go together, where Mr. Oli can dissolve the House again. Now, no Chief Justice would want to be put in a corner like that. Secondly, the Chief Justice has also asked a very interesting question to the lawyers, that is this a majority government or is this a coalition government? If this is a majority government, why was Mr. Upendra Yadav till last year Minister for Health? He left the coalition, he left the government, he resigned, and the party withdrew support from this government. So does that not make this a coalition government of sorts? So there are a lot of lacunas, lot of pitfalls, lot of vacuum where there are legal possibilities for either side. And therefore, even if the reinstated House was to be convened, There is going to be a vote of no confidence motion against the Prime Minister, probably a vote of no confidence motion against the President, probably against the Chief Justice also by the Holy faction, and it's Pandora's box. The coalition government that is going to be formed in a reinstated House will also have great difficulty surviving beyond a few months. So in this kind of a scenario, I already see, and all of us have witnessed, growing protests everywhere. The extreme left is emboldened, the Biplab faction, the right wing wants a Hindu state reinstated. People are hungry and angry. Youth are getting restless. The entire tourism sector is in a state of crisis. There is excess liquidity in the banks. And the GDP growth this year has come down to a mere 1.5%. So I think but we are grateful to the government of India for the swift supply of COVID vaccines, which has just started today. The vaccination has started today, and I think this soft power is going to give rich dividends in the long term for India. All the people are very grateful. But in this kind of a situation where the economy is in turmoil, remittances unsure because the Gulf countries are not hiring extra workers. And in this situation, Indo-Nepal relations, General Mehta, has also seen a roller coaster ride this year. There is no solution to Kalapani, Lipulek, or Limpuadhura until this constitution is alive. Because this territory is now in our national coat of arms. And the coat of arms is in our constitution. Only a 2/3 majority can amend this constitution. The foreign secretary of Nepal cannot negotiate on a constitutional issue. So the border issue is not really an issue between two foreign secretaries. It is in our constitution now. There is a requirement of a 2/3 majority. And will we have a 2/3 majority if a fresh elections are going to be held? It's very unlikely. So in all this situation, it looks like that we are heading for another set of turmoil. If the ground situation deteriorates, there could even be a state of emergency imposed. That emergency will have to be ratified by Parliament within a stipulated time frame, but the House is not, is already dissolved. So we are heading for constitutional vacuum. And we have done a lot of experiments in the past. We even have had a Chief Justice running our executive branch at one point of time. So there is no dearth of possibilities here in Nepal. But I'm sure that with expertise and with proper advice coming from our neighbors, we'll be able to sail through. So I'll stop here and we'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much.
Before I move to Professor Muni, I just have one question. Towards the end, you said you might be seeking advice of the neighbors. What did you mean by that?
Well, now, General Mehta, the ruling party has party-to-party ties with China. So, external forces will be very active if, in case this situation goes out of hand.
Okay, we can come back to this during the Q&A, but thank you very much for that broad overview. You painted a very dismal and a dark picture about the future of politics, domestic politics in Nepal, and how it will impact on stability. You looked at it from largely a Nepali angle. We will now move to Professor Muni, who look at this constitutional crisis from India's point of view, but also look at it holistically in the next 10 minutes or so. Professor Muni?
Thank you very much. Thank you, General Saab. Thanks to the IIC for this opportunity. We have only 10 minutes and I'll make about 4 points very quickly as far as possible. First is that in my mind, there is a violation of the constitution in what Mr. Oli has done. this is not a constitutional crisis, it is actually a political crisis. And this time, the political crisis has twisted it, it has put constitution also in the dock. There is no provision in the constitution adopted by Nepal in 2015 to dissolve the parliament in a manner that Mr. Oli has done. If a prime minister loses the capacity to lead the house, then house should decide who will follow him. Then only a new prime minister can come up. It The makers of the constitution were very alert that they must avoid political instability in Nepal, and that's why they said no vote of confidence against the prime minister and no dissolution of the house. The 2.5 years, you can't move a vote of no confidence against the prime minister, and you cannot, without any understandable reason, dissolve the house. Mr. Oli has dissolved the house, referring that his own senior colleagues were not allowing him to govern. This is not. This is almost a slap in the face of the makers of the constitution, which of course includes Mr. Oli and Prachanda and Madhav Nepal and everybody else. Therefore, it is my first submission is that constitution has been put in a crisis. Primarily, this is a political crisis, and unless political crisis is resolved, you will not have any stability there as it is. It is true that Nepal has remained unstable, and this instability, I think, arises from four major factors. First is it's a fragmented polity. There are several separate groups which are seeking for their identity and their stakes in power. There are weak constitutional and political institutions, and by political institutions, I mean even political parties are weak. The strong leadership is not there. There are revolts in the parties, they get split, and the institutions are very weak. The way election commission has reacted, the way judiciary may react this time, they are really internally fragile, and that's why they are not able to assert themselves. Thirdly, there are very heavily ambitious political leadership, and I think the main source of crisis in Nepal for all these years has been that they have not been able to think of a viable power sharing arrangement. In fact, no leader wants to share power. That's what the problem is. And I would even include the king here, because this is where the constitutional monarchy collapsed. Otherwise, that was the best model in which they could have would have continued. And lastly, I would say outsiders also interfere. India has been interfering. Now China is massively interfering. US has been influencing political currents in Nepal in one way or the other. So all these four issues combined have created a perennial political instability in Nepal, and the polity has not been able to sustain itself in a manner to deliver development to the people. And this is where the present crisis also comes in. The power sharing arrangement between Mr. Oli and Sushil Koirala broke down. Then between Prachanda and Deuba broke down. Then between Oli and Prachanda has broken down. And I'm sure that any new coalition which comes up where there is some element of power sharing arrangement, it will not be sustained, largely because of the ambitions of the political leaders. Unless they contain their own ambitions, there is no way you can look for stability in Nepal. The third factor, as a result of this crisis, there are new forces which have emerged. Hindutva is, of course, a new force. The feudal forces led by monarchy have come back and joined hands with Hindutva and want to get what they lost in 2008, want to restage their own rights and powers. And there are there are political groups in Tarai, there is Nepali Congress, and I am afraid to say that even the Prachanda Madhav Nepal equation is not inherently stable, because UML and the Maoists have contested each other for decades, and they are pitching into each other's constituency. It is more of a what you call an opportunistic arrangement, which came up with the blessings of the Chinese and support of the Chinese, that they have a united Communist Party. Also, because Nepali Congress was not willing to have a better coalition with the Maoists, that this kind of a come up. So you have a fragmented polity, several groups, new forces coming up, and there would be new political equations and alignments. Now, in this kind of a mess, I don't think India should look for. It is natural to look for a favorable government. The Chinese are looking for it. Americans are looking for it. India would want to look for it. But my submission would be that India should keep its distance. The whole situation is very turbulent. It is very flexible. It is very fluid, and nobody knows what actually comes out of it. Let India allow Nepal to settle its politics in any manner it wants to. And once that is done, then only I think India should think of what it can do in the meanwhile is to sustain the humanitarian and bilateral cooperation as much as possible. That humanitarian cooperation and bilateral cooperation also comes in the matter of the COVID, and I think that cooperation has already been extended, and we can see more of it. And bilateral cooperations, there are so many pending projects which should go, and India should improve its image in Nepal, which since 2015 has been very, very severely battered, and even pitted itself against nationalism, which is very unfortunate. So I think what India should do is to keep its distance. If the Chinese want to make concoctions out of the political equations, it is interesting that Mr. Oli has gone to Pashupatinath. Probably that is a message to Hindutva forces that I am quite, sympathetic to this kind of a feeling. Let the Chinese mess up in this political fluidity and do whatever they want to do. I think India would gain out of. The deeper the Chinese go in, the better it is for India. But India should keep away. And I agree with Nischal that no major agreement, no major solution of the disputes is possible when you have such a fluid political situation in Nepal, when you don't know who is the leader, who to depend upon, who to rely upon. Thank you so much.
Professor Muni, for that very interesting overview of the situation, and you make some very interesting points. And I'll take forward the discussion from this very interesting point you make about that one of the factors for the political crisis in Nepal is ambition and the failure of power sharing. And this is absolutely apparent in Nepal in the current crisis, and how the current crisis, and I would like to explore this particular issue, the failure of the power sharing agreement between Pushpa Kamal Dahal and K.P. Oli. You will recall that after the elections in 2017-18, and after they fought as the left alliance. This left alliance between the UML and the Maoists was forged with a great celebration in Nepal. They had these pictures of four former prime ministers together, Jhalanath Khanal. They had K.P. Oli, Pushpa Kamal Dahal, and Madhav Nepal. And at that time, Baburam Bhattarai was also one of the prime ministers. And this left alliance fought the elections, as I mentioned in my introduction, that they got this two-third majority. And between the two leaders of the two merged factions, that is Pushpa Kamal Dahal and K.P. Oli, there was this 2.5 years agreement to share power. And Some of you may recall, especially those in India, that when Pushpa Kamal Dahal Prachanda was invited to New Delhi, he came and spoke at the Indian Council for World Affairs, where in somewhere in early 2018, where I asked him this question about power sharing. This was the last question of his after his presentation and Q&A, and he answered my question towards the very end, and hesitantly he admitted that yes, there is a power sharing arrangement between me and Krishna Prasad Oli. And this particular admission created a lot of problems between the two leaders. But the problem somehow rested there, and it was later in November 2019. That means the problem was set aside, brushed under the carpet, and in November 2019, and I recall I was in Kathmandu, the president, Vidya Devi Bhandari, had brokered an agreement, a fresh agreement, putting aside the power sharing arrangement that never worked, the 2.5 years, and this was that Prachanda would be the executive chairman and that Oli would continue to be the prime minister. And somehow this did not work also. This one man, one post, and the problems continued to grow. And it was in March 2020, that is last year, that the problem again came into the limelight. But at that time, Prime Minister Oli had to go into hospital for his second kidney transplant. And there was some kind of a ceasefire that was declared. And finally, we do know that in April, May of that year, there was this crisis which I had called the Mayday crisis, Mayday crisis, where the Chinese ambassador came to the Hu Yangqi. She came to the rescue of K.P. Oli, because K.P. Oli's faction in the party was in a minority in all the three committees, the Central Committee, the Standing Committee, and the Central Secretariat. And she came to his rescue, and that was the first crisis. She was saved. The next crisis occurred in July, same year, that's last year. And this crisis related to the fact that Mr. Prime Minister Oli alleged that the government of India was trying to unseat him. He referred to the Indian embassy in Kathmandu. And that blew up again. And somewhere in July, again, in came the Chinese, led by Hu Yangqi, and she saved the situation a second time. And as you can see, that the Chinese have played a very big part in this entire rescue operation. And this continued till about the end of this last year, when the Chinese tried. There was a special delegation that was sent from China. They could not save the party, and therefore Oli dissolved the parliament. But in short, this is a political crisis. This is a constitutional crisis, but largely it's a crisis of ego, of ambition, of inner party rivalry, that two factions which were ideologically separate could not come together. And what we see today, as the other two panelists have described, is a situation where we have this matter in the Supreme Court, And Dr. Pandey has told us the kind of questions that the Chief Justice is asking. And therefore, this political crisis will lead to a huge amount of instability. So I'll stop here and I'll use my prerogative as the moderator come panelist to ask a few questions of the two other panelists, my colleagues, and I will start with Dr. Pandey. And my first question is that, as I just explained, how the Chinese and the Chinese ambassador, the Chinese delegations have been able to rescue the party, and their main effort has been to keep the unity of the Nepal Communist Party. That is their main focus. So, can you tell us why is it that this time around the ambassador failed, the delegation failed, and the Chinese are now, as Professor Muni says, are digging themselves deeper into the infirmities of the political crisis in Nepal?
Thank you, General Mehta. Well, India has been involved in every political movement of Nepal since 1950. And Major General Bakshi of the retired of the Indian Army wrote in his Twitter that it has been a self-goal for India to have been involved itself in 2006. There was another interesting piece in the Tribune by a senior official of the Indian Embassy who was working in Kathmandu in 2006, Mr. S. Ramesh, last week, in which he said that it has been a self-goal that after every political movement in Nepal, the dividend has been taken by China and not India. So I think this self-assessment is going on not only within Nepal, but also perhaps between academics and strategic thinkers in India and media persons in India. I also recall a very interesting piece by former Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri in the Tribune, in which he has said, India is the favorite whipping boy of the Nepalese politicians. Now, those are all correct. But the manner with which post-2006, post-Republic, the Chinese have made a grand entry into Nepali politics through party-to-party ties with the Nepal Communist Party is very interesting. Secondly, now they are the largest investor in Nepal, the second largest source of tourists to Nepal. Most of the projects, tenders are awarded to the Chinese companies. You spoke about the patchwork that Chinese diplomats and political party, the Communist Party leaders have done here. But you have missed one point, General Mehta, that both factions, the Oli factions and the Prachanda factions, still continue party-to-party ties with the Communist Party of China. So either way, I don't think it is going to matter to the Chinese as far as party-to-party ties are concerned. Nowadays, no longer do they talk about Sino-Nepal relationship. They talk about party-to-party relationship. I think this is very significant. And this will slowly make Nepal another Vietnam, Laos kind of a situation in which the two sovereign countries are not going to meet. The two parties are going to be more important.
Yeah,
this kind of a situation will have to be gauged very
Dr.
carefully.
Dr. Pandey, can I interrupt you? You know, my question, that's fine. The question really now is this, that why is it that what the Chinese were able to do twice or thrice earlier, you had President Xi Jinping speaking to President Vidya Devi Bhandari. The Chinese ambassador was able to avert two crises earlier. Why is it that they failed this time? That's the question. What is the...
I think Chairman Prachanda has himself given an interview and answered this question. He said that despite of all efforts of external forces, it is ultimately the Nepali leaders that take the final decision. I was hearing this interview just a few days ago in television. I think he's right that when it comes to real power sharing and power dynamics, The Nepali senior politicians have become master of their own laws, and they do the final decision themselves.
Professor Muni, the question for you is that a lot of people in India, former ambassadors and including yourself, have just stated that India should stay out of this mess and let the Nepalese handle this mess. So, what is your comment about India inviting the Nepalese foreign minister to Delhi this month, 14th to 16th of January? And according to reports, it's business as usual.
These are two different things, I think. What I am referring to is the domestic politics and its dynamics, and what you are referring is the bilateral relationship. I think I also said bilateral relationship continue. We must continue with humanitarian assistance and bilateral cooperation. And Foreign Minister's visit to India was largely for the Joint Commission meeting, and I think that's a fairly routine diplomatic bilateral exercise, and it should continue. I'm not saying that India should cut off its relations from Nepal. What I'm saying is that, as not only Nischal has mentioned it, but every major political crisis in Nepal, I must add that Dr. Pandey, it's not India which has gone on its own. The Nepalese have dragged India into the Nepalese political crisis, and they are dragging this time also. My submission is that India should keep away from this domestic political crisis for a very simple reason, that with whatever good intentions India gets involved, with whatever good intentions it wants to have a more friendly and cooperative government in Kathmandu, it would not be able to do that, because the mess inside Nepali politics is so fluid and so uncertain. As I said, the four factors which I counted, and when I mentioned the power sharing, I did not only mean, as General Mehta rightly went into the details of the commitments worked out between two individuals. I meant power sharing in general. Even when coalition is a power sharing, it's not a question of commitment from one leader to another. I don't see that coming up. People honestly sticking to their commitments. Sushil Koirala did not stick to his commitment vis-a-vis Oli. Oli has not stuck to his commitment vis-a-vis Prachanda. Prachanda and Baburam had problems with each other. Prachanda and Deva had problems with each other. Therefore, in such a situation, it is better to let things boil and see whatever the substance remains, probably would settle down in a stable politics. So I'm not mixing it up with bilateral relations. I'm sorry to say, bilateral relations should normally continue, but nothing major would happen in terms of cooperation, in terms of resolving disputes, in terms of differences being removed.
Thank you for that. Dr. Pandey, there were reports when this crisis first erupted and when Prime Minister Oli went and dissolved the parliament, there were reports in Nepal that the entire affair, the dissolution and the other crisis, India is behind this. You know, the India is normally, as somebody, one of you said, that India is, I think you said, India is normally the whipping boy. And I recall in interviews that I gave, that this was the question that was asked frequently of me, that is India behind this? And, you know, they quoted a list of events that had taken place from the visit of the RAW chief, army chief, and things like that, and the phone call by Oli. So, to what extent do you think that Oli was encouraged, Oli dropped by the Chinese, Chinese not supporting Oli? Am I making that a correct assumption that the Chinese were more interested in keeping party unity, and they were also prepared to sacrifice Oli, whereas Oli wanted to keep his position. Therefore, he shifted his preference towards India. Are these assumptions correct? And how did you see them from Kathmandu while you were there?
It's all a confusion. And General Mehta, every chief of RNAW has been visiting Nepal after he assumes office. It's a very routine kind of a visit. But this time, the Prime Minister's office from Kathmandu also issued a statement. I think that was one of the causes for this kind of a controversy. Secondly, there were a flurry of visits after a gap of many months after we, changed our political map. There was the visit of the chief of the RNAW, then there was a visit of the chief of the army staff, and now there is a visit of Nepalese foreign minister. There was a visit of the Indian foreign secretary to Nepal, and that, I think, gave some canon to the people who wanted to spread rumors about India's involvement on the dissolution of parliament. But I do not really look into that from that angle, because it was already coming to a culmination point for Prime Minister Oli. The problem within the party, the pressures from the Prachanda group was already coming to the maximum, and Prime Minister had really got no option either to face a vote of no confidence or to dissolve the parliament. And he, I think, chose the option which he thought would allow him to continue as Prime Minister till the next elections. So I do not really see an external involvement in this kind of a crisis, because it was really an ambition of the Prime Minister. On the case that is pending in the Supreme Court, I will not comment on it because it is sub judice. There are people who are now charged on sub judice cases who have commented in the public domain, in social media, and it is quite strictly forbidden to comment on sub judice cases. Let the court decide whatsoever it wants to interpret the Constitution. The final point on the issue of the Chinese involvement, definitely they wanted to keep the Nepal Communist Party united. Now, there is no doubt about that. They wanted to see the Communist Party united and ruling the country till the next elections, so that the other forces would not be powerful. But now that it has practically split, probably the inclination will be to see that the two parties can at least fight the next elections together under the same umbrella on a seat sharing basis. So I think that will be another option that will be played upon.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pandey, Nishchal Pandey. Professor Muni, the question for you is that where does the United States fit into this triangular relationship, India, China, Nepal? We've had enough discussion on the role of the Chinese in this political crisis, the role of India in normally all the political crises. Where exactly does the US interest lie, and where does the US tie up with India in this triangular relationship? Professor Muni.
US has always been involved in this triangular relationship. And earlier, if you recall the early 50s, it was India and China cooperating with each other, America trying to have its own influence in Nepal, largely to contain China out of the Cold War context. And you remember one of the instances where black flag demonstrations against the Indian delegations were in fact funded by the US information services. Those are the good old Cold War days when then you recall how the Americans funded and trained Khampas to fight in Tibet against the Chinese. They have one agenda, and that is to contain the Chinese influence in Nepal. And this time also, therefore, they are quite active with their MCC proposals. I think $500 million, which they are offering, or whatever assistance they are offering, in favor of democracy and in favor of human rights and these values. But the large purpose is really to keep the Chinese influence as much reduced as possible, because there is a feeling all around, including, I think, to some extent, India shares that feeling, that India alone may not be able to match the Chinese largesse or Chinese penetration into Nepal. Therefore, other countries like Japan and US will also play their role. It is very interesting that India never preferred any outside power to be very active in Nepal earlier. They resisted the US influence, they resisted Chinese influence. This time now there is a little accommodation of the US presence and the Japanese presence. So Japan and India are, Japan and US are quite there in terms of their presence in Nepal. But main battle or main political contest, put it this way, not battle, is continuing to be between the Chinese and the Indians. May I add one more point, that Chinese have much bigger stakes now, because they have their own reasons to be in Nepal. Earlier, they came to Nepal only when Nepal invited them, whether it was 60s or even later on. Now they have their own reasons. They have to protect Tibet. Situation in Tibet is still not very stable for them. If you look at the Xi's the latest moves to transform Tibet in a different way, they have problems because they cannot ignore South Asia. They must come to South Asia and want to come to India. There is a Malacca dilemma. They have a fear of India and the US collaborating against them in Nepal. They have their own reasons, and if Nepal resists the Chinese, like Oli is resisting, or tomorrow Prachanda may resist, or Madhav Nepal and Deva may resist, they will force themselves in, because that's why they have stakes there, strategic stakes, and now economic stakes under BRI. So Chinese presence is going to be a major factor in shaping or unshaping Nepali politics, because they would want to have a pliant government. And as the latest delegation, which came from high powered delegation, which came from China and could not deliver in Nepal, indicates, Nepalese should be saying very proudly that we take our own decisions. So this time, the Chinese may not really be able to do what they want to do, but they'll certainly keep themselves engaged, because their stakes are very, very heavy. And that's why I said, if they want to sink in Nepal's politics, they have, their involvement in elections, involvement in political activities, dynamics, you call it political corruption, inflated budgets of various companies on projects which they are doing in Nepal. Where does this money go? The Chinese are outreaching almost every section of political constituency in Nepal, not only Mr. Oli and the Communist Party of Nepal. They would like to woo, they did woo the king at a time when they wanted to, and they would continue to woo them. They are willing to take Deuba to China. They are willing to take Tarai leaders to China. Their whole deep involvement is very much extensive. You must take note of it.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey, Nishchal. So, leading on from what Professor Muni has said, would it be correct to assume that given the political crisis, given the fact that the NCP is now split into two factions, but the Chinese may still hope, as you said, that they will fight the elections together? Is it as in tennis parlance, a disadvantage for China?
Well, Mehta, there is one caveat here, that the Election Commission has still not declared the two parties as officially split. So the decision that came 2 days ago is very interesting, that legally the party is still intact, and it has two chairpersons, Prachanda and K.P. Oli. And K.P. Oli remains to be the Prime Minister also. So I think the decision of the Election Commission is very, very interesting here, because if the party is not legally split, are we going to go for a reinstated house in that kind of a situation? That has to be watched very carefully. But you are right that de facto they are already split. They are hurling accusations against one another. And in this kind of a confusing situation, the street agitations are going to be more and more violent, because the Prime Minister's faction has also planned a grand rally in the coming weeks in Kathmandu. Prachanda faction's rally was quite big, and the Nepali Congress has also decided yesterday to hold a protest rally against the dissolution of the House. Other smaller parties are also on the streets. I agree with Professor Muni that the Hindutva forces are on the rise, and they will. Why not? This is the time, because they take inspiration from the rise of similar ideology in Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand and neighboring Bihar. So this is pregnant with all kinds of possibilities. And if I would use the tennis parlance, then if the tennis ball is out of the court, then you'll have to wait for the ball to come back.
Thank you. I'll now request the audience to put in their questions into the chat box. In the meantime, we have a question from the audience from Falguni Sundaran Biswal from Kolkata. And the question is, what is the way forward for India's sustained and constructive engagement with its neighbor, Nepal? Professor Muni has answered this, but since you asked the question, if there's anything else you want to add, Professor Muni, you could.
Well, I think India's stakes are very deep in Nepal. See, it's not a question of the present political crisis. There have been many such crises come and gone, and India's relationship with Nepal have always remained there, because civilizationally they are very, very close. Economically, they are very, very close to each other, and people to people relations are very close. So, yes, sometimes political understandings may not be there, and each other's interests may be hurt because of these political deviations. But basically, the relationship would continue with ups and downs. And this is a very mercurial neighborhood, I would say, where Nepal has often taken extreme steps. Sometimes India has also, unfortunately, taken extreme steps, but eventually they get settled to a mutually cooperative relationship they cannot do with each other. So all I can say is the foundations are very powerful, very strong of the relationship, and therefore one should not worry about what happens. Ups and downs will continue, fluctuations will continue.
Thank you, Muni Sahab. There is a question, actually two questions. I'll club the two questions together. One is a question about the Constitution, and I like Dr. Pandey to look at this. That is, what lessons can be learned from the failure, as you yourself said, of the Constitution, and so did Professor Muni, about the fact that there was no provision in the Constitution for dissolution of Parliament, and this is not the first time that Nepal has framed a constitution. I think this is the fourth or the fifth time that a constitution is being made. So that, along with the question about from Mr. B.M. Khanna from Gurgaon, and the question is that in the current crisis, the games China would be playing. I think this has also been partially addressed by our two eminent panelists, and but please have a shot at it, Dr. Pandey. These two
Thank you, General Mehta. I have answered one in the chat box itself, and Professor Muni has actually nailed it, that the constitutions has kept on changing, but it is the same game that is being played. The lack of power sharing arrangements, the game of one-upmanship between the leaders. We've had, 5 constitutions in the last 6 decades, 20 governments in the last 20 years. But the problem here is that the leaders have remained practically the same. The constitutions have changed, the regimes have changed, governments have come and gone, but the leadership by and large remains the same. So none of the political parties really want to give way to the younger breed of leaders. And the irony of all ironies is that the younger breed of leaders in Nepali Congress, the Communist Party, and RPP and others are themselves getting old now. The young Turks of Nepali Congress are in their 60s. So this is the tragedy of Nepali politics, that we keep on changing our constitutions, but we don't change our leaders. I think there is the problem.
Answered. I think this is a relevant point, that in the leadership crisis, and I think crisis is the right word, that as I think it was Professor Muni who mentioned in the 4 points that he made, that one of the big melee of the political parties, all the political parties, there are a minimum of 2 or 3 factions that are pulling at each other, and the top leadership is the same. There is no second generation leadership. The only new leadership you see today it comes from the Maoist party. You have a much younger lot of people that emerges from the Maoist party, whereas when you look at all the other parties, there were minimum of 2 to 3 factions, if not 4 factions. Yes, Professor Muni, you want to add something?
Well, I want to disagree with both of you on the new leadership. I think leadership has been changing. Look, I mean, the quality of BP Koirala and MP Koirala as against Girja Prasad Koirala and Bhattarai, Kishan Prasad Bhattarai, I mean, as against, Oli and Madhav Nepal and Prachand. These are different leaderships. That's not the issue. As I said, the party structures are so fragile internally and fragmented, and the whole polity is fragmented. Now, in the present situation, therefore, leadership may change, but unless the context, the substance, mati of politics does not change, it will remain the same. You will produce the same. Secondly, I want to put one of my fears on the table. My fear is that elections may not be held at all for either judiciary reasons or whatever else reasons. And if it is extended for another 6 months, or if Mr. Oli is having different political alignments and alliances, say with the Maoist, say with the Hindutva forces, and want to bring monarchy back, you will have to get rid of this constitution. My fear is that the constitution may be vitiated, and if the constitution is vitiated, you never know. Somebody can appoint a committee to look into the constitutional aspects which are there or not, because whether Mr. Oli has gone against the constitution, this can be an excuse to set up a committee to review the whole constitution. Therefore, my fear is that this is a real crisis, as General Mehta said earlier, I also said earlier, it's a political crisis which has got constitution in its hold. And my fear is that something of a serious damage to the constitution may not happen if the crisis does not get resolved fast enough.
What the point that can still be made is that we are talking of different generation of leadership, and we may have other ideas on current state of leadership. For example, Sher Bahadur Dyopa in the Nepali Congress, or K.P. Oli in the UML. But that apart, on this question of elections, Dr. Pandey, Nishchal Pandey, or this matter is not sub judice on the question of elections. So, out of the two scenarios in the earlier part, you mentioned restoration of the house, and you had points in favor and against. But on the question of elections, is out of the two, which is a better option, simply academically?
Well, that is also sub judice, because that will put me in a clear faction of one or the other. But I think the sub judice case will determine what Professor Muni said about this constitutional crisis, because the court will have to decide one way or the other whether the Prime Minister's decision is validated, under what grounds, under what clauses of the constitutions and articles of the constitution. Because as a layman, we don't see many articles in favor of this dissolving of the parliament. If the parliament is to be reinstated, then we will have to brace ourselves for several other crises to come. Vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister, vote of no confidence against the President, probably a vote of no confidence against the Chief Justice. Because mind you, this constitution has several flaws. And one of the greatest flaws is that the moment a vote of no confidence is registered under a head of the constitutional body, he ceases to function. So the only faction can always bring out a vote of no confidence against the Chief Justice. So you are not talking about a small problem here. Three major executive heads will lose their position after the House is reinstated. That's a major crisis for me. So therefore, this decision of the Supreme Court will be a hallmark in the political history of Nepal. If the elections are to be held, I think the Election Commission has sufficient time. It needs budget. But the problem here is, will the Prachanda faction contest the election? Will the opposition parties contest the elections? So therefore, this fear that Professor Muni mentioned about the elections not being held for a prolonged period of time is very valid, because there is another constitutional provision that elections has to be held within 6 months from dissolving the old parliament. Now, if that cannot be held, then there is another constitutional crisis. So, as you see, there are a lot of flaws in this constitution.
So many wheels within wheels.
General, may I ask a question to Dr. Pandey?
One second. Crisis within crisis. But overall, I mean, I can make this point that if a fresh election is held, it opens up a brand new arena for the political parties, and especially the Nepali Congress, which traditionally, if you notice or if you remember, that in 2008, after the Maoists, in 2013, after the elections were held, the Nepali Congress returned with the single largest majority. And after the Maoists had not, there were lots of charges of corruption. Yes, Professor Mani.
Dr. Pandey, why do you say that the vote of no confidence against the Chief Justice, if he restores the Parliament? There is nothing wrong with him. If he restores the Parliament is not going to pass a vote of no confidence against Chief Justice.
That's right. There is a constitutional provision, Professor Muni, that if only a vote of no confidence is only registered, it does not need to be passed. If it is only registered against the Chief Justice, it has happened in the past already.
The registration will depend upon the Speaker. The registration will depend upon the Speaker.
He can't function as the Chief Justice.
Please, the registration will
that is a constitutional flaw.
Yeah, I think this
the only faction can always register a vote of no confidence against the Chief Justice.
Dr.
For
Pandey,
having sided with the Prachanda faction.
Dr. Pandey, I think we can do this on email, but I think what you have mentioned is opens up many possibilities, many difficulties, and this is very unfortunate for Nepal, And it comes at a time when this COVID crisis is very much there on the cards. You talked about the economy. We talked about the cost of we didn't talk about the cost of the elections. The cost of the elections are something like 10 billion Nepali rupees, in less the cost of security that will be deployed. So, between the options that are there for the Chief Justice and the various problems that have been enumerated by our panelists, I think you will agree with our panelists that the situation is pretty complicated, pretty complex, and very unfortunate that this is happening at a time of a crisis of the COVID pandemic, and at a time when Nepal's economy is in the downturn. Uh, we hope that the Chief Justice and the Constitutional Bench, which today I think is it's the 13th day of the hearing, continuous hearing of the writ petitions, the 13 writ petitions, and one hopes that some solution is found, the least painful solution is found, and that Nepal can resume its movement on the road towards regaining a modicum of stability, and that it's able to handle that the crisis, the natural pandemic, the pandemic crisis, and that India, in its COVID diplomacy, will be able to assist Nepal to the extent that it can. So, on that mixed note, we will draw curtains on this webinar. All that is left for me to do is, on behalf of the India International Center, is to thank Dr. Pandey, Professor Muni, for their contribution to this webinar. And for the audience, thank you very much for being with us. You can watch this on YouTube later. We will be back next month on the India Neighbourhood First series, I think on 26th of February, for a discussion on another country. Till then, goodbye, namaskar, and thank you for watching.